Very happy to see you all, and apologies.
Thank you for being here. Okay, so one thing I want to acknowledge in light of all those introductions is just the great disciplinary and intellectual diversity that we have in the room and beaming into the room today. So we have people who are part of scholarly communities in computer science, in biology, oceanography, communication, information science, and we have folks who have deep experience working within the academy, in national labs, and industry. So what brings us all together here today? Why are we here? And by that, I don't necessarily mean the existential question of why is there something rather than nothing, although that's interesting as well. But why are we all part of this conversation today? And I would say it's because we've all demonstrated in one way or another that we're committed to thinking about scientific software as an object of study or an object of reflection or an object of intervention or an object of some other kind of inquiry. And so humanists and social scientists have a long history of taking science as an object of inquiry. But for a long time, that inquiry tended to be focused on what you could think of as the outward visage of science. So for example, they wrote about the forms of reasoning that are used in scientific argumentation, or letters written between famous scientists who made some discovery or another, or typologies of theories and methods. But a few decades ago, we started to see a shift away from thinking about and studying the products of science and focusing more so on the production of science. And so that led to close examinations of how science actually unfolds in practice. And it's really important, of course, to acknowledge that there are many non-trivial theoretical and methodological differences among those even who share this commitment to studying science as a practice and studying its production. But within that great diversity, I think it's still possible to identify a few important tenets that kind of cut across that work. And so one of those is that what practitioners of science do is just as important as what they know. And indeed, what they do is inextricably tied to what they know. What practitioners of science do impacts and is impacted by the milieu in which they're embedded. And so whether you choose to talk in terms of culture or institutions or networks, and all of those concepts and ideas are kind of loaded with different theoretical commitments and implications. But regardless, I think the common denominator is that we need to consider the context in which practitioners of science are embedded. And then finally, what practitioners of science do is heterogeneous and emergent, by which I mostly mean that scientific practices are not monolithic, but varied, and they're sensitive to context, and they're not fixed, but constantly evolving. And I think the premise that really brought us all here today is that these tenets are important not only for those of us who study science or conduct social studies of science, but also that it's really impactful for practitioners of science themselves to acknowledge these ideas. And so I hope that these ideas are kind of a foundation for the rest of our discussions today. And so that leads me to the goals of our workshop. I think first and foremost, to make these ideas and other ideas from social studies of science part of the conversation around scientific software, especially at the early onset of the virtual institutes for scientific software, to identify particular practices and questions about practices that are most salient in the development of scientific software engineering within the academy. And then finally, to hopefully spark future collaborations that are rooted in an understanding of scientific software engineering as a social practice. And I know a lot of the topics we're going to be covering, you've all seen the agenda, and many of you have talked with me in depth about the agenda and what it would be great to cover today. So I know that a lot of these issues are things that are already on people's minds and already a part of the conversations that are going on in all of our institutions. But I think one of the things we'd like to see today is, whether we can kind of shift those conversations into a slightly different register by thinking about how those concerns are embedded within the contextual, the structural, the political, the cultural, the normative, and the mundane realities of what it means to create scientific software. So that is all for me. And then I'd like to invite Vani Mandava to come up. And Vani is going to give you an introduction to the Scientific Software Engineering Center here at the University of Washington and how that fits in with the Virtual Institutes for Scientific Software more broadly. And I think that will be really helpful to kind of get us on the same page about sort of what the scope and scale of this phenomenon is, and you know, what we're talking, what we mean when we say scientific software in this particular context.